Boldwood presents Happy Endings at Mermaids Point, written by Sarah Bennett and read by Annabel Inge. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. "Grab that end, will you?" Nick's father, Andrew Morgan, gestured to the opposite end of the brightly striped windbreak he was wrestling with. It wasn't that breezy, but the taut piece of fabric would help their ever-expanding family group to stake a claim on the beach and provide a visual guide back to the right spot as the narrow stretch of sand filled up. There was plenty of space on the pebbles behind them, but it was one of the few days over the summer when no one was working, and his father was determined to grab a prime spot, which was why the two of them were out on the beach before 7:30 a.m. setting up. With the late August bank holiday weekend behind them, the point was rapidly emptying of tourists, and the Morgans and the Nelsons wouldn't be the only local families taking advantage of the glorious weather before they fell back into the routines of school and work. Nick held the wooden pole in place, while his father hammered it into the sand with a rubber mallet and tried not to think about the 1,000,001 tasks waiting for him back at the warehouse. His parents didn't ask much of him, so when they'd gone to all the effort of coordinating a family day, it was the least he could do to show up with a smile on his face. Apart from his aunt, Nerissa, who worked at the local doctor's surgery supporting her partner, Tom Nelson, who'd arrived just about a year ago to take over the practice, their entire extended family relied on the tourist season to keep their heads above water. Everyone had worked flat out through what had been an incredibly successful season, thanks to a prolonged period of high pressure over the UK, which had led to a particularly warm summer. His parents ran a gift shop on the seafront, his sister the adjoining cafe. Alex, Tom's brother and a good friend of Nick's, had taken over the village bookshop in the spring. Although everyone still referred to it as the bookshop, it had grown into so much more, thanks to Ivy's innovative fashion and homeware designs, which occupied one half of the shop. Nick himself helped his uncle run a pleasure boat business out of the old harbour. Juggling his commitment to Uncle Tony while trying to project manage his new venture to turn an old warehouse into 4 modern apartments had been a struggle. Nick had leaned heavily on Rob, his lead contractor, to keep things running smoothly. From the enthusiastic way Rob had greeted the prospect of a day off-site, Nick fully expected he would see him, his wife, and their 3 small children making the most of the sunshine. Hopefully, it would earn Nick some goodwill when things got down to the wire with the warehouse conversion and the inevitable late nights needed to get things done on time. Now summer was almost done, Nick would have more free time away from the boats, and he intended to throw every hour he could into getting the flats completed before the weather turned. Leaving his father to roll out the straw mats that would keep the worst of the sand off their towels, Nick raised a hand to shield his eyes and stared out across the calm expanse of blue ocean. Mornings like this made it easy to believe they would enjoy sunshine forever, but like all residents of the point, he knew better. Come the winter, that blue blanket would be a seething mass of dark grey, topped with white rollers crashing in to swallow the sand and halfway up the pebbles too. "We couldn't have asked for a better start to the day," his father observed as he came to stand beside Nick. "I know there's as many hard times as there are good, but I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." Nick swallowed a frustrated sigh. Though his dad probably thought his comment was the height of subtlety, it was one of many similar observations various members of the family had made to him in the past few months. They sensed the restlessness inside him, and he knew they were worried about it. He was worried about it. His project to convert the old warehouse overlooking the harbour into 4 apartments was supposed to have given him a new focus, as well as providing him with a home of his own because he was too damn old to still be holed up in the back bedroom at his parents' house. As he'd started looking at the sample books, he'd found himself choosing the same neutral kitchen units and bathroom tiles for all 4 of the flats, rather than his original plan of designing one to his own specific tastes. Best to keep his options open, the small voice in the back of his head had said, in case he decided to rent or even sell the place at a later date. He should have been brimming with excitement at the prospect of finally having a home of his own. Instead, he just felt flat. A group of bobbing pink swimming caps caught his eye, evidence of the local open water swimming club making the most of the peace and quiet before the bodyboarders and pleasure bathers took over the water. Grabbing at the chance to steer his father away from any more well-intentioned pep talks, Nick pointed them out. "I wonder which one is Linda?" After a shy start while she'd found her feet, Linda had thrown herself into all sorts of surprising activities since she'd followed her son Jake to the point. They were both such a part of the family, it felt like much more than a year since Jake had come to the village to investigate a rash of mermaid sightings that had gone viral and fallen in love with Nick's younger sister Laurie. "Probably the one near the back who's waving at us," his dad said with a laugh as he raised his hand to return the greeting. Soon, half the swimmers were waving and calling out good morning as they breaststroked past. There were a few in the group who took things more seriously and were ploughing through the gently rolling waves like one of the Brownlee brothers trying to win Olympic gold in the triathlon, but most were happy to go at a pace where they could chat as well as keep an eye on each other. Nick's gaze wandered beyond the swimmers to the scattered islands on the horizon known locally as the Seven Sisters. After his years taking tourists and birdwatchers out to view them, he knew all the secret landing spots. Nick turned away, cursing himself for thinking about Linda, which had led to thinking about Jake, those stupid mermaid stunts, and therefore, no. He would not let his brain spiral around that hopeless loop yet again. Shaking himself like a dog emerging from the ocean, as though she could be shaken off as easily as droplets of salt water, Nick marched back up to the spot they'd staked out and began laying out towels over the mats. The others would be here soon. Laurie had promised them bacon rolls in return for their early morning efforts, and Nick would not let anything spoil the day, even his pathetic yearning for what could never be. Nick's mum, Sylvia, arrived a little over half an hour later with Laurie and Jake in tow. His sister waved when she spotted them, holding up an insulated bag that Nick fervently hoped carried the promised bacon rolls. Jake trailed a few steps behind, his brow creased from the effort of lugging a pair of enormous cold boxes, which were no doubt packed with other tasty treats Laurie had prepared to sustain them. With the cold boxes tucked deep in the shade of an oversized sun umbrella, Nick settled on his towel and began to unwrap the silver foil that was keeping his roll warm. The smell of crispy bacon made his mouth water, and he half closed his eyes in anticipation of the first bite as he raised it to his lips. Splat! A dollop of something cold hit him on the back of the neck, and he ducked reflexively from the shock of the unexpected sensation. He turned his head, only for his mother to grasp it from behind and force him to face the front. "Keep still while I rub this in," she scolded him, as her fingers began to rub at the sun cream she'd squirted from a large bottle. "I can do it myself," Nick grumbled, trying to shift away so he could eat his breakfast. "I'm 28, not 8. "Oh, hush, you big baby. I'll be done in a minute," his mum admonished, before leaning around to plant a kiss on his cheek that made Nick want to roll his eyes and smile at the same time. Sylvia Morgan was a force of nature, and it was pointless trying to change her, not that Nick wanted to, for all her fussing. Nick shot an imploring look towards his father, who was grinning around his own half-eaten roll. "Best do as your mum says, lad. You know she'll get her way in the end." So much for moral support. Nick stared glumly at his roll for a moment before wrapping it up with a sigh and setting it on the towel beside him. Leaning back slightly, he let his mother finish rubbing in the sun cream, only protesting when she yanked at the neck of his T-shirt to reach down inside the neckline and almost cut off his air supply in the process. "Enough, Mum, seriously." With a click of her tongue, Sylvia Morgan shuffled on her knees towards her husband, who only let his grin slip for a second when he realised he was next in line for the same treatment. Letting his own smug smile stretch his lips, Nick retrieved his breakfast and wolfed it down before anything else could spoil his enjoyment. He'd just finished the last bite and handed his scrunched-up bit of silver foil to Laurie when a chorus of greetings, including an enthusiastic bark, announced the arrival of the Nelson family group. As well as Tom, Nerissa, and Tom's 2 teenage children, Emily and Max, the party included Alex and his girlfriend and business partner, Ivy, and his parents, Archie and Phillipa. Last but by no means least was Linda, rosy-cheeked from her swimming exertions. She'd moved into the upstairs flat at the surgery on a temporary basis back in the spring, but no one seemed in a hurry for her to move out. Although they still lived in London, Archie and Phillipa were currently staying with their eldest son, while Archie recuperated from a broken leg after an ill-advised attempt to prune the wisteria without someone to hold his ladder. Nick noticed he was having to use a stick to negotiate his way over the slippery pebbles, but at least he was up and about, which would be a relief to everyone. Alex had told him he was avoiding the surgery because his father's temper seemed to grow shorter as his convalescence continued. The scowl Archie cast at his eldest son when Tom dared to offer him a hand spoke volumes. Oblivious to any tensions in the new arrivals, Toby, the family's boisterous golden retriever, was beside himself with excitement as to who he should greet first. Nick managed to fend off an enthusiastic lick, but his dad wasn't so lucky and received a full face washing. Toby had belonged to the previous doctor and somehow wound up staying on at the surgery after he retired. It had worked out all around, as Max had bonded with the soft-hearted dog, and it was plain for all to see the pair were now inseparable. Doc had moved in with his long-term partner Barbara, who not only lived in a cottage too small to comfortably contain a large dog, but also owned a very fussy cat named Carlotta. Carlotta had a lot to answer for when it came to people adopting unexpected pets, as Alex and Ivy had ended up being caretakers for an enormous black cat, aptly named Lucifer. Barbara had promised to take Lucifer in when old Mr. Cavendish had sold up his bookshop and moved to Cornwall. Carlotta, however, had other ideas, so Lucifer had kept showing up at the bookshop until the new owners had caved in and let him stay. Alex and Lucifer shared something of a tolerate-hate relationship, although the old bruiser was starting to soften towards his new owner and only clawed him every other day. As he scrambled up to help the Nelsons get all their stuff sorted out, Nick couldn't help but laugh as absolute chaos descended. Tom and Archie were giving entirely contradictory instructions about what should go where, while Max tried without much success to stop Toby from poking his inquisitive nose into the bag where Laurie had stashed their rubbish from the bacon rolls. The women were all ignoring the men as they exchanged hugs and kisses, as though they hadn't all seen each other the day before. Nick glanced around at his dad, who was wisely sprawled on his towel with a paperback shielding his face from both the sun and the mayhem around him, and thought yet again that he could do worse than follow the example his father so often set. As the noise around him reached a crescendo, Nick struggled to imagine what life must be like at the surgery, with everyone on top of each other. His parents' place was much quieter since Laurie had moved into a cottage Jake was renting up near the top of the large outcrop of land that gave the village its name. But even so, Nick was itching for some solitude. As soon as the basics were done, he intended to move into the warehouse, even if he had to manage with little more than a sleeping bag on the floor for the next couple of months. Spotting a football in amongst the jumble of bags, towels, and other paraphernalia, Nick snatched it up. The only way things stood a chance of settling down was to thin out the group a bit. "Fancy a kickabout?" he asked Max, who was still wrestling to get the dog under control. Toby wasn't a badly behaved dog for the most part, but like all retrievers, he thought more with his stomach than his brain. "I'm in," Jake said, catching on to Nick's plan as well as the dog's lead. "Enough of that," he told the dog in a low, firm tone, which Toby instantly responded to. Jake was a quiet man, but there was a presence about him that was impossible to ignore. Max shot Jake a grateful grin, and the three of them moved a few steps away from the rest of the group. "Anyone else joining us?" Nick called out. "As long as you don't mind another thrashing," Alex said with a laugh, towing out of his trainers and jogging over to join them. He raised a palm to his nephew, who slapped it with his own. "Dream team united, eh, Max?" The teenager whooped. "We kicked their ass." Max swallowed the word, as both Nerissa and his grandmother whipped their heads around to shoot him a warning look. "Bottoms," he finished in a chastened tone. "If you give me 5 minutes," Tom said, sounding harassed as he wrestled with a large reclining garden chair. "Here all right?" he asked Archie. "A bit more in the sun, I think," Archie replied. "It's fine where it is." Phillipa, Archie's wife, cut across him. "You know what the doctor said about that mole on your arm?" There was a brief moment of tension between the two before Archie's frown relaxed into a fond smile. "Where would I be without you looking after me?" He allowed his wife and Tom to ease him into the chair, his leg obviously still quite stiff. As soon as he was settled, Phillipa turned to Tom. "You go on with the rest of the boys, and we'll sort everything else out." Nick couldn't hide a grin as Tom glanced around at the sea of female faces, all wearing the same expectant expression. For a man used to the responsibility of being the village doctor, it must be something of a blow to the ego to be dismissed so readily as being surplus to requirements. Nick's dad tossed aside his book and stood. "Come on, Tom, let's leave the ladies to it and show these youngsters a thing or two about how to play football." His dad could always be relied upon to smooth things over. Too many people were fooled by his easygoing nature and readiness to laugh, but Nick didn't think there was anyone with a better insight into people than Andrew Morgan. Still wearing something of a distracted expression, Tom allowed Andrew to sling a friendly arm around his shoulder and steer him over to where the rest of them had gathered. "Morgans versus Nelsons?" Alex suggested, taking advantage of Nick's distraction to snatch the ball from his grip and start jogging down the beach to a quiet spot where they wouldn't risk annoying anyone. "You really are desperate to lose, aren't you?" Jake bantered back, as he made his own feint for the ball and almost knocked the two of them into the surf in the process. After 20 minutes of a raucous combination of blatant cheating, hastily invented on-the-spot rules, and the unrestrained enthusiasm of the dog, which both teams claimed to be on their side, everyone was soaked to the skin from multiple tumbles into the water. Tossing his 2 long curls out of his eyes with a shake of his head, Nick sent a deliberate spray of salt water towards Alex, who had just finished trying to dry his face with his saturated T-shirt. "Cheers," Alex said, wiping his cheek and throwing Nick a mock glare. "Any time," Nick responded in his most cheerfully annoying tone. Even with Max's creative scoring method, Team Morgan had emerged victorious. "Beers are on you tonight, then," he pointed out to his friend. Alex grimaced before he broke into a grin that made him even more impossibly handsome than usual. It really wasn't fair for one man to look as good as he did and be such a nice bloke. No wonder Ivy had fallen for him, hook, line, and sinker. Nick pushed the thought away, still not quite ready to come to terms with the reality of the two of them being together. Even though they'd never dated, there'd been an expectation growing up that Nick and Ivy would somehow end up together. Their mothers had been best friends since their school days, a relationship that Ivy and Laurie had echoed, apart from a brief period of estrangement. Nick had seen Ivy as another little sister when they were younger, but he'd be lying to himself if he said he'd not noticed the way she'd grown into a beautiful, caring woman. Even though there'd never been much of a spark between them, he'd found himself wondering more than once whether their friendship might one day lead to something more. Which all sounded a lot more calculating than it was. He cared deeply about her, respected her, and knew they'd have been able to build something lasting between them if they'd both been willing to put in the effort. Not every relationship started with fireworks and skipped heartbeats. He knew better than most that scorching chemistry wasn't enough to hold on to someone. especially when that person had the whole world at their feet, and all he had to offer was a part share in a tourist boat business in a backwater village clinging to the far reaches of the west coast. For all his restlessness, Nick still thought the Point was the most beautiful place on earth, but a penny arcade on the seafront didn't exactly make it comparable to Las Vegas. And gigging in the back room of the Sailor's Rest sure as hell wasn't a 3-month residency in the showroom of Cleopatra's, one of the largest hotel and casino complexes in Sin City. It was such a ridiculous comparison, Nick couldn't help laughing out loud. "Hey, my cooking's not that bad," Alex protested, proving that Nick had been lost inside his own head once again and not paying attention. "Sorry, I was thinking about something else." The sympathetic look his friend shot him as he clapped him on the shoulder did little to lift Nick's mood. Turning his attention away from what could never be, Nick slung a friendly arm around Alex's waist as they strolled back along the beach. "I'm listening, I promise. Tell me what's on the menu for this evening." It didn't take long for the heat of the day to dry off their clothes, and soon everyone was lazing around in the sun or the shade, reading books or listening to music. Nick had removed his t-shirt to make the most of the glorious sunshine and was contentedly listening to a cricket podcast when a shadow passed over him and he raised a hand to shade his face as he opened his eyes. It was only Aunt Nerissa and Tom taking the chance to steal away for a bit of quiet time. There was a bit of a kerfuffle behind him when it looked like Max might be trying to join them, but he was quickly dissuaded by Sylvia, who caught the lad by the wrist and tugged him down to whisper in his ear. Whatever she said made the boy's eyes widen before a huge smile broke out across his face. He settled happily at Sylvia's side to tackle a puzzle in the thick book on her lap. Amazed as ever at his mother's persuasion skills, Nick turned back to watch the couple strolling along hand in hand at the edge of the water and smiled quietly at himself before settling back down on his towel. He was pleased Nerissa had found someone who adored her in the way she deserved after so many years of being alone. Maybe he should take a leaf out of her book and learn a little patience. To be fair to Nerissa, her first big love affair had ended in tragedy rather than a mildly dismissive text message, so it wasn't any wonder she'd found it hard to move on. All Nick had done was fall in love with someone who was unobtainable. He'd gone into it with his eyes wide open, and they'd been apart for more days than the cumulative hours they'd spent together. So why couldn't he put her out of his mind? Realizing he'd missed the last 5 minutes of his podcast, Nick rewound it and tried to recapture the chilled-out mood he'd been enjoying. It almost worked. His podcast ended, and Nick tugged out his earphone with a sigh. It had gone in one ear and out the other. Before he had the chance to open his app and find something else, his mum leapt to her feet and raised a hand to shade her eyes as she stared at something down the beach. "Is that them?" Sylvia asked, before adding in a more excited tone, "Yes, he's waving. Andrew, that's the signal." Turning, she gestured impatiently at Laurie. "Oh, what did you do with the keys? Hurry now." "I've got them here." Laurie tossed the keys to the cafe towards her dad, who was scrambling up from his towel. "Do you want Jake to give you a hand?" She didn't need to ask, as Jake was already up and shoving his feet into a pair of battered trainers. Confused at the sudden commotion, Nick watched the two of them depart at a jog. "What's that all about?" "You'll see," was all his mother would say, with an infuriatingly smug smile as she hurriedly resumed her seat. "Act natural, everyone." Nick cast a bemused look towards Alex and Ivy, who shrugged. Turning to glance in the direction his mother had been looking, Nick received a swat on the back of his head with her puzzle book. "Don't stare, you'll spoil the surprise." "I can hardly spoil something when I don't have a bloody clue what's going on," Nick grumbled, but he snatched up his father's discarded paperback and pretended to read it while casting the odd, furtive glance down the beach. Moments later, Jake and his father returned, the latter somewhat more out of breath than the former. They stowed what looked like an insulated bag and a large cardboard box in the shade behind Archie's deck chair, then flopped down on their towels. Nick handed the book back to his dad, but Andrew didn't have a chance to open it before Tom and Nerissa arrived back from their walk. They were both beaming from ear to ear, and Nerissa had tears in her eyes. The moment she thrust her left hand towards them to display a simple diamond solitaire on a gold band, everything fell into place. As the congratulations rained down on the happy couple, Nick leant towards his father and nudged his arm. "This is why you wanted us all together today, isn't it?" His dad grinned as he threw an arm around Nick and tugged him close to smack a kiss on his cheek. "It might have been one of the reasons, yes, but not the only one." As he pulled back, Nick noticed Nerissa wasn't the only one with tears glistening in their eyes. For all his size, Andrew Morgan had a heart as soft as a marshmallow. Nick found he was also having to swallow around a sudden lump in his throat. "I'm so happy for you both," Sylvia cried as she hugged first Nerissa, then Tom. "We must drink a toast to your future happiness." Jake and his father's mad dash made sense when they retrieved a couple of bottles of champagne from the insulated bag, together with a stack of disposable plastic glasses. As Sylvia handed a plastic flute full of the golden sparkling wine to Nerissa and a second to Tom, he raised an eyebrow at her presence of mind. "I never doubted you for a second," she said, giving his cheek a quick pat. "Or you," she added, grasping Nerissa's free hand and giving it a squeeze. "If ever there was a couple who were made for each other." She turned away with a laugh, fanning a hand in front of her face to ward off her own tears. "Oh, give me a glass of that before I start blubbing, for goodness sake." With their glasses charged, they formed a circle around Tom and Nerissa. "To the happy couple," Nick's father said, raising his glass. "May you bring comfort and joy to each other every day." "To the happy couple," they all chorused, then sipped their champagne. Max and Emily crowded in, one either side of Tom and Nerissa for a hug. "Can I be a bridesmaid?" Emily asked, all big eyes and excited smiles as she leaned into Nerissa's side. "Of course you can, darling," Nerissa replied. "I can't think of anything I'd like more." "Can I not be a page boy?" Max asked in a wry voice that made them all laugh. "I thought you might be my best man," Tom said to his son, with a quick, almost apologetic look towards his brother. "Fabulous idea," Alex said, showing no signs at all of feeling slighted at Tom's choice. "Nick, Jake and I can be ushers." "Can we?" Nick poked his friend in the ribs. "Maybe ask before you volunteer me for stuff." He'd been joking, of course, but when he caught a shadow pass over his aunt's face, he hurried over to reassure her. "Whatever you need me to do, I'll be there. Just let me know the date when you're ready." Nerissa exchanged a quick glance with Tom. "Oh, we haven't had time to discuss the practicalities." Tom curled an arm around her waist. "I don't want to wait too long. Perhaps we could do it sometime over Christmas." His suggestion was greeted with another flurry of excitement, mostly from the women, who immediately launched into a discussion about dresses and capes and the like, which Nick quickly extricated himself from. Moving back to Alex's side, he clicked their glasses together. "Good call about the usher thing," he said before taking a sip. Alex shrugged as though it was no big deal. "I could see Tom was worried, but there's no need for him to be. I think it's only right that they involve Max and Emily right in the heart of everything. Nerissa's not just marrying Tom, she's making a permanent commitment to them too." "Good point." Nick glanced back at his aunt. He'd always wondered what people meant when they said someone was glowing, but no longer. Happiness seemed to shine from Nerissa's very core. He was delighted for her, delighted for all four of them, for building a family after so much heartbreak. "Christmas, eh?" he muttered, staring at the bubbles in his glass. That gives me a few months to sort out a date, I suppose." Jake had wandered over to join them. "What was that about a date?" "I was just saying I've got a few months to sort myself out, so I'm not the only sad singleton at the wedding." Nick paused, a sly grin forming. "Unless your mum is in the market for a toy boy, that is." Perhaps he shouldn't have said that just as his friend was taking a sip of his champagne, Nick thought, as he thumped a choking Jake on the back. No chance, Jake wheezed when he finally caught his breath. Hey, I'm not that bad. Nick held his hands up in protest. I'd be the perfect gentleman. It's not like we're likely to feature on one of those morning scandal shows. My new dad is also my brother-in-law. Nick and Alex both burst out laughing. You're so funny, you're almost a comedian, Jake said with a roll of his eyes before he joined in. Even if the idea of you dating my mum wasn't completely abhorrent, I'm afraid you're too late. Linda's got herself a boyfriend, has she? Alex gave Jake a none too gentle nudge in the ribs. I bet you're thrilled about that. Jake mock-punched Alex in the arm, almost spilling his champagne in the process. Keep your voice down, he hissed. I'm not sure she's ready to go public with him yet. They all looked over towards Linda, but she seemed oblivious to their conversation, her head full of plans for the wedding. Don't tell anyone, but she's been on a couple of dates with Pete Bray. She's playing it casual, but I think she likes him. Jake sighed. Oh, it's about time she had someone treat her right. I hope he doesn't let her down. Pete's got a heart of gold, Nick reassured him. The landlord of the Sailor's Rest had been divorced for a while now, and he and his ex-wife got on fine, which said a lot about the man's decent nature. Jake's father had died the previous year, and, well, the less said about him, the better. I hope they make a go of it. I think they could be really good together. I do too, Jake sighed again. It's a bloody weird thing worrying about my mother's love life, I have to say. Nick found his gaze wandering over to his own parents, who were snuggled up against each other. They'd been sweethearts since school and were still clearly smitten with each other, which was great and all that, but not a topic he liked to dwell upon. Best not to think about it too much. Jake gave a shudder. Give me another drink and let's change the subject. The impromptu celebration wound down, and everyone settled on their towels and in their deck chairs to enjoy the sun. Nick had only been half joking about finding himself a date for the wedding, but as he looked around at his friends and family, it struck him anew that life was passing him by. His thoughts strayed once more to the woman who'd stolen his heart with one curve of her Cupid's bow mouth. Even if he was brave enough to risk another rejection by reaching out to her, there seemed little point when she was an ocean away. His gaze strayed to the gentle rolling waves, as though he could see across the Atlantic. From the bits and pieces he'd seen on social media, she was making a new life for herself. It was past time he tried to do the same. Hoping some music might distract him from his melancholy thoughts, Nick decided to do something useful and start building a playlist for Tom and Nerissa's wedding reception. Reaching for his phone, he opened his Spotify account, took one look at the top trending artists the app was pushing, and immediately closed it again. If fate wanted him to forget about Aurora Storm, it had a funny way of showing it. Chapter 1. You were great, Aurora. You really knocked it out of the park tonight. You had them eating out of your hand. Accepting the stage manager's effusive praise, together with a bottle of water and a crisp white towel, Aurora managed a smile of thanks before making her way to a plastic folding chair in the corner of the backstage area. The sweat soaking her short blonde hair was already cooling thanks to the cranked-up air conditioning. She shivered as she hooked the towel around her shoulders. Hands shaking from the adrenaline, she wrestled with the lid of the water bottle before finally managing to unscrew it. She preferred the pop-up style, but unlike some of her co-stars on the rather aptly named Divas Tour, she tended not to make a fuss over things like that. The stage crew all had more than enough on their plates, and Aurora hadn't fallen for her hype to the point where she had her agent, Dennis, adding a list of demands to her contracts. Though her throat was parched, she forced herself to take small sips of the water. She'd made the mistake once of chugging it down early in her career and vomited the whole lot back up on the suede shoes of a creepy executive from her record company. At least he'd stopped trying to invite her out to dinner after that. although perhaps that had been down to Dennis. He'd been apoplectic when she'd let it slip that the exec had been hanging around too much. His thinning hair and slightly drooping jawline had always reminded Aurora of a sad-looking bloodhound, but Dennis was pure Rottweiler when it came to protecting his clients. The roster at the agency he ran with his wife, Hetty, had a high proportion of female clients. It was one of the things that had attracted Aurora in the first place, and she had thanked her stars on many occasions over the past 10 years that it was his door she'd gone knocking on as a naive girl with a big voice, bigger dreams, and absolutely no clue of the realities of life outside the working-class town she'd grown up in. As she took delicate sips of her water and listened to the glorious tones of Marcy Johnson, the multi-platinum-selling superstar who'd gone on stage after her, Aurora felt a million miles away from that girl. Not for the first time, she found herself missing home. How was it possible to miss somewhere you'd never felt like you fitted into in the first place? A wave of loneliness swept over her as she looked around the crowded backstage area. She recognized all the faces, but hadn't managed to learn everyone's name in the madness of joining the Divas' 2-week residential concert run at the last minute. One of the original announced lineup had been forced to drop out at the last minute due to a nasty bout of laryngitis, and Aurora had been asked to step in. It was a reflection of how well her breakout tour earlier in the year had been received. These shows were the culmination of a very successful year, which had included her first forays into acting when she'd guest-starred in a couple of long-running network TV shows. It had been equal parts fun and terrifying, and she found herself bitten by the acting bug. Dennis was always on the hunt for new opportunities for her, and he'd taught her that saying yes was nearly always worth the risk. He was the reason she'd had the chance to trip the light fantastic on Strictly and spend a wild couple of weeks in the Australian rainforest on I'm a Celebrity. She had to admit she much preferred learning the tango to enduring some of the eating challenges, but both had been the kind of experiences she'd never dared dream of as a girl. Doors were opening for her left and right, so why was she pining for a tiny back bedroom in the cramped terrace house her parents wouldn't leave, even after she'd offered to buy them a lovely new home? "Can I get you anything, Miss Storm?" A bouncy, sweet-faced girl of about 19 or 20 was smiling down at her, eager to please in any way she could. Racking her brain for the girl's name, Aurora shook her head. It began with a K, she was sure of it. Not Kelly, but something similar. "I'm fine, thank you, Kaylee." Kaylee's grin made Aurora glad her brain had snatched her name out of the ether at the last minute. "No problem. I'm around, so just give me a wave if you change your mind." She hesitated, then leaned a little closer. "I know we're supposed to be professional, but I just have to tell you how much I love Home Again. I must have listened to it a million times." "That's so sweet of you, thank you." Aurora leaned in as well, adding to the conspiratorial nature of their conversation. "If you want a photo together, then catch me tomorrow when I'm fresh out of makeup and not all red-faced and sweaty, okay?" "Oh, I love that. Not that you don't look beautiful all the time, of course." Aurora laughed at the horrified expression on Kaylee's face. "Don't be daft. I always look a fright when I come off stage." Though she'd ironed a lot of it out, a few of her northernisms slipped out now and again. She rose from the chair and gave the girl a reassuring pat on the arm. "You are doing a brilliant job. Thank you for looking out for me. Come and find me tomorrow before the show, okay?" "Okay, I will." With another beaming smile, Kaylee dashed off. On stage, the singer who'd followed Aurora was ripping through the final notes of her most famous hit. The power in her voice sent another shiver through Aurora's spine. Really, it was some kind of miracle that she was surrounded by so much amazing talent. She ran through the rest of the show in her head. There were 2 more acts before the headliner was on, and then there was a mix of duets and trios, one of which she was involved in, before the show wrapped up with everyone on stage to sing I'm Every Woman. Aurora headed towards the dressing room for her costume change and a check-over by the makeup team. The stuff they used was pretty much bulletproof, but Aurora never went on stage looking or sounding anything less than perfect. People had paid their hard-earned money to see her perform, and they deserved the very best she could give them. An hour and a half later, she was showered and changed into what her dad would have called a trackie and trainers. If he had any idea of how much the aquamarine ensemble had cost, he'd have been horrified. No, not horrified, just confused and maybe a touch sad about how little the two of them had in common these days. When she'd first started attracting attention, Aurora's instinct had been to hide herself away in baggy clothes and under baseball caps. All that had happened was she'd been photographed anyway and plastered on the showbiz pages looking like a bag lady. Blending in was the key, and here in Las Vegas, colourful resort wear made her blend in with the tourists much better. People saw the colour first. A few glances might linger on the shape of her figure, but very few concentrated on her face. Switching out the contact lenses she wore on stage for a pair of black-framed glasses helped a lot. Clark Kent had been onto something with that disguise. Riding down from her hotel room on the penthouse floor, her hide-in-plain-sight strategy held up when a couple entered the lift a few floors later and barely offered her more than a smile. They were too intent on checking the lift was heading to the casino level, their eyes already full of dollar signs as they discussed their strategy for the blackjack and poker tables. Aurora listened to their conversation with half an ear. The tables had never attracted her, but she'd been tempted by the flashing lights and the frenetic music of the slot machines a couple of times. With a strict budget set, she'd spent a carefree couple of hours winning a bit here, losing a bit there, and people-watching to her heart's content. The casino wasn't her destination of choice this evening, though, and she exchanged a polite farewell with the couple as they alighted the lift and carried on down to the street level. The lobby area was heaving with people, busier than she'd ever seen it, even for a Friday night. She guessed many of them were taking advantage before the prices jacked up for the Christmas holiday fortnight. Instead of making her way to the huge bank of revolving doors that led out onto the bright lights and sleazy shadows of the Las Vegas Strip, she headed for a side entrance that opened out into the hotel gardens. As much of a tourist attraction as the casino and showrooms inside, the extensive outside space was a gaudy reimagining of ancient Egypt, complete with pyramids and a sphinx whose eyes changed colours like a pair of giant disco lights. Fountains shot up in all directions, dancing in time to the booming, ostentatious trumpets of Verdi's triumphal march from Aida. Aurora loved the gardens. They were kitsch and cheesy and fun, but they were also a masterpiece of plants, trees and flowers. People might come to be photographed with one of the actors dressed as pharaohs in elaborate headdresses, or temple dancers in diaphanous robes and pencil-straight black wigs. But whoever tended the gardens behind the scenes had the greenest of fingers. Without their hard work, the display would be nothing more than a handful of foam models. She'd had a few guilty pangs about how much water it must take to create this lush oasis in the desert climate of Nevada, until she'd bumped into one of the gardeners, and he'd mentioned during their conversation that the hotel collected the grey water from the hotel showers and sinks, and, thanks to a filtration tank hidden in the depths of the giant pyramid, they used it to water the gardens. She wandered in quiet solitude for a few minutes, needing to decompress after the excitement of the show. It didn't matter if it was the first night or the last, it still took her hours to unwind enough to get to sleep. She paused by one of the dancing fountains, not thinking about anything, just enjoying the clever display, when a voice came from just behind her. "Excuse me, can we have a photo taken?" Damn. Aurora closed her eyes for a second as she reminded herself that this was part and parcel of doing the job she loved. Fixing a bright smile, she turned to face the woman who'd spoken to her. She was slightly older than the usual fan who sought Aurora out for a selfie, but they were the reason she enjoyed a life of relative privilege. and she wasn't so far removed from her own upbringing to remember what it was like to be a fan. It had taken a huge amount of willpower not to gush like a giddy schoolgirl at Marcy Johnson and all the other divas when she joined the show. Pushing back the hood of her top, Aurora ruffled a quick hand through her short hair in case it had been squashed. "Sure, it'd be my pleasure." "That's so kind of you," the woman gushed, thrusting her phone towards her. "Bud and I are on our honeymoon." The woman smiled indulgently at the greying man at her side. "We were childhood sweethearts, you know, but both ended up married to other people."
"Come on now, Helen. This poor young woman doesn't need our life story."
Slowly, it dawned on Aurora that they had no clue who she was. They just wanted a snapshot to commemorate a special moment. With a grin at her own hubris, she studied the phone and quickly located the photo app. "How about we change places so you have the fountain behind you?" she suggested. "Oh, that would be just darling," Helen said with a beaming smile as she herded poor Bud into place. "Are you two staying here at the hotel?" Aurora asked, while they fiddled around trying to find the perfect position in front of the fountain. "Yes, it's so beautiful, isn't it, Bud?"
It should be for what we paid for it,"
he grumbled, but there was an indulgent smile that said it was worth every cent for the way Helen was gazing up at him. His smile dimmed a little.
"I chose it because Helen is such a big fan of Marcy Johnson. I didn't realize the concerts were all sold out when I booked it."
Helen patted his chest. "Don't start that again, Bud. I told you it doesn't matter one bit." Aurora finally got them to stand still long enough to snap a couple of shots of them, the second of which managed to catch the full effect of the water and lights behind them, a fluke of timing rather than any skill on her part as a photographer, but they were delighted nonetheless. As she handed back the phone to Helen, Aurora offered her hand to Bud. "Well, it was a pleasure to meet you both, and congratulations on your marriage, Mr.
Callahan,"
he replied as she'd hoped, with the automatic politeness of someone of their generation.
"But you can call me Bud."
"Well, congratulations, Bud, and to you too, Helen. I hope you enjoy the rest of your honeymoon." She slipped away into the darkness while they were still admiring the photo she'd taken. As she ducked behind a large bank of cacti, Aurora heard Helen comment on what a nice girl she was. Grinning to herself, Aurora hurried back into the hotel to have a chat with the concierge. Up until now, she hadn't had anyone to gift the handful of VIP tickets she'd been allocated as part of her appearance with the divas, but that was about to change. She was still imagining Bud and Helen's reaction as she crossed the lobby and entered the 50s-style diner that was one of half a dozen different restaurants incorporated within the hotel. Even this late in the evening, it was still busy with people scoffing down mountainous burgers and slurping on milkshakes so thick it was a struggle to draw the liquid up through a straw. Pleased to see her usual spot at the counter was free, Aurora hopped up onto the low-back stool covered in vibrant red vinyl and waved at Gus, the night manager. Flicking the tea towel he'd been using to polish some glasses over his shoulder, Gus wandered over.
"Here's our girl, and looking mightily pleased about something. Show went well?"
Aurora nodded. "Oh, it was great. I can't believe there's only a handful of shows left." It was the 12th of December, and the final show was scheduled for the 15th. They'd been due to finish on Sunday, but ticket demand had been such that they'd tacked on a couple of extra shows on Monday. They couldn't extend it any further, as another show was already booked in. As it was, the crew would be working all night to break down the staging and transform the concert hall into a replica big-top show ring.
"Gotta make room for the holiday extravaganza. How's your circus skills?"
She laughed. "Oh, sadly lacking, so I'll have to give it a miss, I'm afraid."
Gus grinned. "I was thinking about auditioning for the flying trapeze, but I don't think my alley will be too keen on the idea."
He cast a quick glance towards the pretty woman who was filling a stack of glasses with the soda fountain hose. A good foot shorter than her husband, she ruled the diner with a sharp wit, a ready smile, and more energy than a woman half her age. "Unless they need an extra clown, Augustus Mackey, you'll be staying right where you are." As dry as her words were, they were softened with a smile of deep affection. She swept up the piled-high tray of drinks and was gone before her husband could say a word. Aurora tried, and failed, to turn her laugh into a cough when Gus turned wounded eyes towards her. He held the hangdog expression for all of 2 seconds before he burst out laughing. "No chance of a man getting too big for his boots with you two around, that's for sure. Now then, honey, what'll it be tonight?" One of the reasons Aurora had started eating regularly in the diner was Gus and Allie's willingness to adjust their menu to suit her needs. She'd had a chicken Caesar salad the first night, not realizing the chicken was coated in a thick layer of breadcrumbs, or that the salad would be doused with quite so much dressing. When Gus had caught her look of dismay, he'd whipped it away despite her protests and returned a short while later with a steamed chicken breast nestled on a huge mixed salad with a jug of dressing on the side. She'd come back the following evening to find he'd sourced a lovely piece of salmon from the kitchen of the high-end restaurant that was also part of the hotel complex, and served it up on a bed of rocket with a baked potato and fat-free sour cream. She hesitated for a moment, thinking about how delicious the burgers had looked as she'd passed a table near the door. Performing burned a lot of calories, so the occasional blowout wasn't a problem, but it was just too late. She'd be prone on her bed nursing a food belly and unable to sleep if she indulged herself too much. "I'd like a salad, please, and a jacket potato if you've got a smallish one." "Absolutely. How about a little grilled steak on top of that salad?" "Perfect. And a small chocolate shake and a glass of iced water as well, please." "Coming right up." With another flash of his brilliant smile, Gus bustled off to fix her order. As she waited for her drinks to arrive, Aurora cast an eye around the bright interior of the diner. The combination of shiny chrome, dark polished wood, and the bright leather seats made it feel a bit like sitting in one of those huge American classic cars. She'd seen a few of them cruising up and down the strip, and couldn't imagine what it would be like trying to drive one. Since living in London, she'd given up her car, a tiny little Ford with several careful owners that her parents had saved hard to provide for her when she passed her test. There'd seemed little point when public transport was so much easier than fighting her way around the crowded roads of the city. If she needed to get anywhere now, she was nearly always provided with a driver. The enormous Cadillacs looked more like boats than cars, and if she tried one of the monster trucks that were another popular choice in Vegas, she'd probably need a booster cushion to see over the steering wheel. Gus set her drinks in front of her with a quick wink, distracting Aurora from her rambling thoughts. The first sip of the delicious, creamy shake was so cold it sent a stab of pain to her temple. "Brain freeze," she said with a rueful grin to no one in particular as she rubbed her head. The shock of sensation faded as quickly as it had come, and she ventured a second tentative sip. She could almost feel the sugar rushing around her veins, so it was just as well she'd shown enough restraint to order a small one, or she'd never sleep later. "So, what are your plans for when the shows are finished? Are you sticking around for Christmas?" Gus asked as he buffed the already spotless counter between them. Aurora shook her head. "I'm going back to the UK on Wednesday to stay with some friends." She was staying with her manager and his wife, actually, but that would sound pathetic. Besides, Dennis and Hetty were her friends, and closer to her these days than her parents. She'd let her mum and dad know she was going to be back home for a couple of weeks, but they hadn't called her back with a definitive date for a visit. There'd certainly been no suggestion she should go home and spend Christmas Day with them. It wasn't that they didn't get on. It was more like she'd never fitted in with them. Like a cuckoo who'd been laid in the nest of a pair of meadow pipits, she'd always been too big and loud for a couple like Ross and Kim Powell. He very much favoured a quiet life. She shrugged the thought away. There was no point in feeling sad about a situation that was unlikely to change. The phone she'd tucked in her hip pocket before leaving her suite vibrated, making her jump. Aurora retrieved it, unsurprised to see Dennis's name on the display. "Morning, Dennis."
"Hello, Petal. How's tricks?"
Though he'd never smoked a day in his life, Dennis Rouse had the raspy tones of a man who lived on cigars and cheap whiskey. He sounded more like an East End barrow boy than one of the most successful and well-respected agents in the business. "Good, thanks. You're up early."
"Like a bloody lark, me," Dennis quipped. "Look, I know it's late there, so I'll cut straight to it. I've had an email from Chad Logan's production company, and they're interested in you for a part in his next film."
Chad? Remembering where she was at the last moment, Aurora clamped her lips tight to stop herself from blurting out the name of one of Hollywood's biggest stars. "I'm just grabbing something to eat," she muttered as she glanced around, suddenly paranoid she would be overheard. The other diners paid her absolutely no attention, their focus on their meals or their own